And now let me welcome Chen from the Ford Foundation to moderate the next panel.
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. Okay. You guys ready? Okay, we're going to jump right into this last session, as it is getting late in the afternoon. I'm Don Chen with the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation's mission for the last 75 years has been to promote social justice and to help reduce poverty around the globe. We have our headquarters in New York City and 10 offices on 3 continents in the rest of the world. And I'm in a part of the foundation called Metropolitan Opportunity. This is a relatively new unit within the foundation that was established in 2009 and builds on our long history in working on community development, affordable housing, and infrastructure development as pathways towards poverty reduction and out of poverty. And I'm very happy to be joined with 3 esteemed chapter authors who contributed pieces to this State of the World 2012 book. I have to my left Michael Replogle of the Institute on Transport and Development Policy. Next to him is Diana Lin, the Executive Director and Editor-in-Chief of Next American City. And then next to her, Joe Foti from the World Resources Institute. So welcome everyone here. I wanted to note a few things about the Ford Foundation's work within the context of Rio+20 and the broader effort on sustainability. We're actually approaching this from probably a slightly different entry point from the way in which many of you have entered this conversation. Our focus is on something that we're calling just cities, and we see sustainability as a key component of the pathway towards just cities. And so for a number of years we have focused on a variety of different aspects of this set of things. Number one, we've actually worked on rural issues for quite some time, many decades in fact, really underscoring and demonstrating that people in rural areas, indigenous populations, are really excellent stewards of natural resources when they're given acknowledged rights to manage those resources in a sustainable manner. Another aspect of our work has been to really try to ensure that civil society organizations are an integral part of discussions about the green economy, about economic growth, about all of those types of things that have come up time and again during this conversation. And then the last piece really is about sustainable and just urbanization, and that has a variety of components, but again, it's very focused on making sure that civil society is participating in the many decisions that we see happening within the urban realm. And as you can read in the book, and you've seen, no doubt, in many venues, the process of urbanization is really quite strong in the world today. We have, of course, a majority of the world's population in cities at this point, and those numbers will just continue to increase to a point where I believe it's by 2050 or so, 75% of the population is expected to be residing in the world's cities. This may cause many to be worried and concerned because of the implications about resource consumption, and you can go down the list of many different impacts. We're a little more sanguine about that because we see it as an opportunity to really address issues of greater resource efficiency, of greater attainment of asset building livelihoods, of those types of things, as we continue to support the activities in a variety of different country settings as the foundation proceeds with its work. So that's just a little bit of context for the reason why the Ford Foundation has gotten involved in these issues, and I'd like to now turn to our chapter authors to ask them about their perspective and contributions to the book. And I'm going to start with Michael. Michael, you've been at this for many years, and your chapter is about, with Colin Hughes, who's also here, the co-author, Colin's right here, about attaining sustainable transport in the context of Rio+20 and beyond. And one of the things that you've really placed a lot of emphasis on is working with international institutions on global agreements. And would love to hear your views on how your chapter relates to Rio Plus 20, and then on that particular emphasis in your chapter.
Great. Thanks, Don. Well, I think thanks to Worldwatch for organizing this really interesting forum today. And I think, as Don said, we're facing a time in history when, over the next couple of decades, the amount of people living in cities will increase by several billion. And if that pattern of urbanization follows a sustainable pattern of urban development and mobility, then there's good hope that we can, in fact, manage our growth of economics and population in a way that minimizes the damage to our ecological footprint. If, however, we follow in that urbanization pattern, the worst examples we see today in places like the United States, in the pattern of urbanization and consumption of private motor vehicles, then the planet faces a massive catastrophe, not just ecologically, but also in terms of public health. Right now, there are 1.3 million people a year who are killed in traffic accidents in the traffic system. 90% of those are in developing countries. More than half of them are pedestrians and vulnerable users of two-wheelers, bicyclists. That number is expected to grow by 80% by 2020, while falling by 30% in the richest countries of the world. An equal number of people are dying every year from air pollution, a large part of which comes from motor vehicles. The patterns of transportation consumption and urbanization are largely chosen for people by the governments and the communities where they live, the nations that set tax rates and control land policies and the like. We live in constrained markets, and advertising by companies bathes us every day, encouraging us to consume more mobility. Individual choice has some role in that, but to expand travel choices and options and to foster a more sustainable mobility system, we need to rapidly take to scale the kinds of best practices that we now see in places like Guangzhou, China, which have developed a bus rapid transit system that within the span of opening just a year and a half ago went to 800,000 passengers a day and increased public transport ridership in that city of 9 million by 20%. We can take those kinds of solutions to scale and take to scale the bicycle and pedestrian-based transport systems that we see operating in some cities in Asia and Europe, and to take to scale some of the best practice strategies we see in places like Singapore and Stockholm for managing traffic, so that the remaining motor vehicle traffic isn't stuck in congestion, but indeed pays its full freight and then some, so that we can then create a stream of revenues to support more sustainable transport. All of those are actions taken by governments, and that's one of the reasons why, as we go to Rio now in 2012, it's important to renew the actions that were first taken in Rio in 1992, when sustainable transport did have a strong place in the Agenda 21. But there was no take-up to that agenda in the 1990s. Transportation, sustainable strategies really languished and in fact didn't appear anywhere in the Millennium Development Goals, even though sustainable transport is an imperative foundation for reducing poverty and addressing equity and human well-being in a lot of ways. So as we go to Rio Plus 20 and we look for the building blocks for sustainable development for the coming decade, it's important to learn how transportation can fit back into that picture of sustainable urbanization. And I think we're encouraged that Secretary General Ban Ki-moon this January, in releasing his 5-year action plan, for the United Nations around sustainable development identified transportation as one of the 5 key building blocks of sustainable development. So we're seeing a lot of uptake of this now. We went from having one mention of transport in the first draft of the zero draft of the agenda for Rio Plus 20 to now having well over dozens of mentions in the draft language under negotiation. And I think we will see sustainable transportation get more attention from multilateral development banks through voluntary commitments at Rio to increase institutional capacity building, as well as to increase the flow of financial funding towards sustainable transport. Because unfortunately, today we still see the vast majority of investments in the transport sector moving towards unsustainable transport rather than sustainable transport solutions. Although right now we're still moving in the wrong direction in many respects, I see a lot of promise to steer this massive enterprise into the right direction so that as we move out towards 2020 and beyond, transportation will be part of the solution and we'll get that DNA for our cities laid down right so that we can move on a sustainable urbanization path.
Thank you, Michael. And speaking of steering a massive enterprise, Diana's chapter in the book is about information and communications technologies, or ICTs, as you've acronymed it. We're in Washington, so you can do that. I reflect on your chapter as I think about Worldwatch's work over the years. You've got the companion document, Vital Signs, and really one of the things that is key to sustainability is really tracking progress over time. And being able to understand the performance of different interventions, policies, practices, etc. And so it seems to me that the application of these ICTs to the challenge of sustainable development or sustainable urbanization, to be more specific, holds a lot of promise. But I also think, as a cautionary note, as the New York Times covered recently, we're entering this era of big data. In which, as Michael was just alluding to, big data is being used increasingly for advertising and the selling of goods and for all kinds of more mercantile purposes. And I'm curious, from your perspective, as you plunged into this, the task of exploring this issue, what you're starting to see within the context, again, of course, of Rio Plus 20 conversations. Are these tools being embraced? And what you see in the future.
Sure. Thanks for that sort of intro. And I think, as you put it, I think this is very much a nascent field right now. Information and communications technologies, on the one hand, hold a great deal of promise for cities in terms of, cities are growing and expanding at this increasing rate in a lot of developing countries. There's a ton of infrastructure that's being built and tons of people, lots of action going on that you want to track and have information on, whether that's your transportation system or crime statistics. And a lot of big companies have jumped in to sort of fill that analytics gap. So, on the one hand, there's a lot of opportunities here to sort of develop greater efficiencies in terms of the sort of economics of a city and the environmental sustainability of a city. On the other hand, there's this big question of really how do we, what are the best tools for achieving these kinds of sustainability goals and using technology to suit that. In my chapter, I talk a little bit about 3 different actors that we're seeing working in cities to get information about sustainability out there to the public, analyze it, and understand it. In Rio right now, in fact, there's a big public-private partnership between the city and IBM to develop a big data center, which will explore visualizations about how the city should respond to massive flooding in the city, and whether they should close down transportation or tell people not to go into work or travel that day, to better understanding where there's been a recent crime outbreak and how to send police there. This kind of analytics program that IBM is producing is part of a $57 billion industry that is being rolled out around the world, where companies, not just IBM, but Siemens, Cisco and a whole host of others, are really kind of stepping in. And I think that there's great opportunities there to figure out, is a city having problems with its water infrastructure, and how much water and energy could a city save by kind of better understanding where the leaks are, where the faulty infrastructure is, and using the data that is produced and kind of understanding it better to create greater efficiency in a city. On the other hand, I think that there are another whole host of other actors who could potentially step in to help cities better understand the data that they're producing and kind of what that means for the sustainability of a city. So, in addition to big companies, we're seeing kind of small nonprofits working with cities. So we're in DC right now, where a number of various different nonprofits participated in the Apps for Democracy contest, or various other apps contests, to develop things like transportation apps for DC or other cities, using data that's provided openly from the transportation system. So we're seeing in a lot of other cities that just by opening the data from government agencies, coders or even nonprofits are able to kind of take this information, produce online applications or even data visualizations that will get people to understand how to catch a bus, or the sort of economic impact of owning a car. And then thirdly, we're seeing a lot of just sort of the general population producing their own information that sort of by crowdsourcing, they're able to kind of contribute to the increasing sustainability of a city. So after the earthquake in Japan, people who didn't trust the sort of official radiation reports were kind of taking their own Geiger counters and using kind of Google Maps open software to map radiation that actually conflicted with the official reports. And so this kind of crowdsourced information production being shared online or even through text messaging, this is a particularly interesting tool for cities or countries where people may not have the greatest transparency from their government, or the greatest sense of accountability from their government. So those are just a couple of the different examples of how there are these different actors working in cities. I think that the sort of the question of really how will big data and information technology really influence sustainability over time, it's still, I think, pretty much unanswered. We're just starting to see some of the results of that.
I think one very interesting thing about Rio Plus 20 is this discussion about the registry of commitments idea, the idea that all countries, even local governments, states and provinces, and even private sector actors need to just put their commitments about sustainability on the table or in the cloud, in the internet somewhere, so that they could all track that performance over time. And technology will play a very important role to that, and I think questions about interoperability and those types of issues and frankly quality control will be very important in that effort. And Joe, your work is very related. As Diana was wrapping up, she mentioned transparency and accountability, and your chapter in the book, of course, is focused on local governance issues, and as you've noted, making sure that the public has access to information, making sure that ordinary citizens or residents have access to the participation process in decision making, and then finally having access to a legal system that can hold decision makers and others accountable for the actions that they're responsible for. And you, unlike many people, I think World Resources Institute has been following this ever since the very beginning, focused on Principle 10, and would love you to share your views on your outlook for how that will fare in Rio and then, of course, beyond.
Thanks, Don. So I'm going to start with a story to illustrate a lot of these abstract principles that Don was talking about. It's a real story which is featured in the chapter that I wrote. There's a city called Bamenda close to the Nigerian border in Cameroon, and if anyone knows Cameroonians, they're all named after principles and virtues. So the hero of this particular story happens to be a lawyer whose real name is Justice. And so Justice is someone who I work with in a network of NGOs worldwide called the Access Initiative, which works on open government issues that have to do with environment. And so he was driving to work every day and going past the same dump on the side of the road, which is spilling into the river that goes through the middle of Bamenda, which is called the Mezam River. And he said, this is something that we have to clean up. So he went and he asked the city council that he thought it was, when are you guys going to clean up this illegal dump that's on the side of the river? And they said, oh, I'm sorry, you seem to be mistaken, Justice. You see, with all due respect, it's not City Council 1 that's responsible for that dump. That's well within the jurisdiction of City Council 2. He went to City Council 2, and they said, again, my esteemed colleagues are mistaken, but in fact, it's City Council 3 who has jurisdiction over that dump. So he did what a good lawyer would do, and he brought all three of them to court, asking them to demonstrate who was in charge of it, who was going to clean it up, what the plans were for law enforcement, and enforcing those basic laws. It ends up that this case not only got the river cleaned up, but it set a massive precedent in Cameroon. Because in Cameroon, it's still under old French colonial law, and you can't sue for environmental issues unless you prove that you got harmed. So this was the first public interest case in Cameroon that's ever been upheld by a court. And this is emblematic of the kind of little victories and the kind of little changes that can go on in local governments, but that can really add up to changes in those countries and how business is done at a whole national level. And Africa, as you know, is a rapidly urbanizing area. So this gets to the fundamental issues of who's in charge, who's answerable, and who's accountable. And this was one of the real things, one of the real success stories maybe that came out of Rio 1992, is this issue of Rio Principle 10, which some people call the environmental democracy principle. So it's about transparency, it's about public participation, it's about access to justice. And we've had a lot of progress since 1992 in this. One of the things that's happened is since 1992, environmental impact assessments now cover something like 183 countries of the world. And most of those have public participation in them. The number of pollutant release and transfer registries, or as we Americans call them, toxics release inventories, now covers something like 45 countries from 4 or 5 at the time of Rio 1992. Freedom of information laws. These now cover national governments in the majority of the world. So these are real successes that we've really opened up government, and we can ask, those of us who are activists on the ground can really ask good questions in a lot of countries. But they haven't spread to cities in a lot of places. While there's been innovative cities like Mexico City that have been real proponents of these ideas, other cities have completely slipped out of this, and they're really the real problem where sustainable development needs to meet the road. There's questions of municipalities, there's questions of regional planning, there's questions of authorities. These haven't been tackled. One of the things that we did in the chapter, and I won't go through it here because of short time, is we listed a whole bunch of reforms. Local sunshine laws, open meeting laws, the kind of things that we can ask for that if you're a citizen of DC, you've seen they've actually made a difference in us moving towards more sustainable transport or a more sustainable, hopefully, sewage system and runoff in the future. So to skip real quick to Rio and what the cities can deliver for Rio and what Rio can deliver for cities, there is really good news for people who are in sustainable cities, but it's not actually in the official negotiations. As Don mentioned, it's this registry of commitments or compendium of commitments, whatever it's called. The idea that folks can go to Rio and they can unilaterally commit to achieving one of the sustainable development goals or to one of the energy access goals, and these we can begin to move towards whether or not we have international consensus on how we're going to get there. So what can you do between now and June? And I hope you think about this. Fortunately, the clay is still wet because negotiators tend to do things at the last minute. So what you can do, I would say ask yourself 3 questions on whatever issue it is that brought you here today or that really gets you excited, which is 1, is your favorite elected official going? Ask them that. Go ahead and call them. See if they're going. There will be the C40 meeting. There will be the global town hall. There will be a big event on open government, citizen participation. All of these will happen there, and hopefully commitments will be launched. So ask if your official is going. Think about what do you want from them, and then tell it to them. I want you to commit to something at Rio. And then ask yourself the question of what are they delivering? What's their plan? How are you going to get them to do it? Those 3 questions, I think, can get us a lot farther, even though we only have 2 months, to making Rio. We know we probably won't have any major multilateral agreements coming out of it, but we can actually get major sustainable development goals and projects off the ground in those next few months if we do that.
Thank you. And I'm told that we have until 4:50 for questions before we move on to the next, right? Okay, so why don't we start taking questions with this gentleman over here? Yeah, you, sir.
Again, thank you. Ed Barry with the Sustainable World Initiative. Everything that we can do to make cities more efficient in terms of the use of resources is great. It's important. It's critical. We have to do it. But I'm concerned about the context in looking at the global picture. And I can tell you, and I think we all here recognize, that humanity's overusing planetary resources today. And therefore, in that context, I have 2 questions. One is, how do you define what a sustainable city is, or a sustainable transportation? And you talk as if, well, there's sustainable cities and unsustainable cities. But no one seems to say, what is the definition of that? That's my first question. And then my second question is it your vision that if we just make cities more efficient, that somehow we'll end up with a sustainable world? Thank you.
A very good question. I think at its core, transportation, most transportation systems are not very sustainable. A lot of what we're striving for is to make more sustainable transportation systems, or transportation systems that better support sustainable development. And indeed, the whole term sustainable development, as we heard some previous speakers say, is again subject to the same kinds of questions that you raised about what is sustainable. I mean, ultimately, I think the Iroquois Indians had a fairly prescient wisdom around this in saying that decisions should be taken that take respect for the 7th generation. And so in thinking about sustainable transportation and how do you define that, we've actually formed a working group of international experts that is working on trying to come up with at least a rough consensus to support the discussions at Rio+20 involving multilateral development banks and a number of key actors. But one of the things that we're wrestling with there is, I mean, it has to touch on all 3 pillars of sustainability in terms of social sustainability and equity, environmental sustainability, and economic sustainability. And it ultimately has to respect intergenerational sustainability, so not using up the resource base. And it needs to support the economy in ways that deliver at least basic equitable access to goods and services so people can meet their basic needs, and to do so without using up the planetary resource base. So those are the sort of basic parameters around that. And we're moving from highly unsustainable and trying to move in a direction of sustainability. And that's the best I think we can do right now in this area.
Yeah, I would just add that I don't think that energy efficiency or resource efficiency is really the only indicator of what is a sustainable city or not, and that whether a city is worth living in or not is really generally defined by the social and economic sustainability of that place. So can somebody find a job there? Do people have access to opportunity? That, those are often the sort of very important criteria that attract people to cities or not in the first place. I think that the question of whether, what are the indicators of what is a sustainable city or not, it shouldn't be, are you Seattle or Portland or not, or something like that. On the other hand, I think that, sustainability is, so far as I see it, is, can we continue, with this particular issue, can we continue in this direction, and is that a good thing or not? So, for example, if our... I keep on thinking of water infrastructure. I don't know why, but if our water infrastructure continues to degrade at this particular rate and is creating a stormwater runoff problem and pollution in our river and whatnot, is that sustainable to continue to have this kind of infrastructure? If that is not the correct direction, something needs to be corrected there. And sustainability, so far as I would define it, is we could continue with this particular level of growth, or this level of carbon emissions, or this level of, whatever indicator for 7 generations, or the long term, the foreseeable long term.
We have another question. Yes, in the back.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Barber with the Integrated Strategies Forum, and my question is, how useful do you think it would be if in this Compendium of Commitments, each UN commission was asked, or no, let me put it different, that each country was asked to monitor, to identify a national contact point who would be responsible for monitoring and reporting on that country's progress in achieving sustainable production consumption patterns, which back in Johannesburg was identified as one of the overarching objectives, but it wasn't clear like how you measure progress towards that objective. So each country is asked to identify a contact point, single contact point, to monitor and report on that. And as part of that kind of monitoring system, we also have the UN appoint have a contact point within each of the UN regional commissions to also monitor what's going on within the region and report on that, say every 5 years.
Okay. I think I'll try to address more general issue with the Compendium of Commitments. The Compendium of Commitments really reflects a kind of weariness of overly centralized promises that people are making and then not delivering on them, negotiating either treaties that they don't have any intention of carrying out, or goals that no one is accountable for. So the idea is that we already have a bunch of already agreed upon sets of goals. And whether the UN would house a particular initiative or not, it's really a multi-nodal idea here, that there would be maybe at the Secretary General's level, there would be a central registry that would provide the APIs and the data interface for all kinds of other initiatives. So, Jeffrey, if you guys have a sustainable and consumption and production initiative, get it up and running, get some governments to start committing, get a coalition of the willing of companies that will help commit to that. Use your own structure, basically, is the idea, and then get the data interfaced with the central registry. Same thing for those of us that are in, I work on issues of open government. We want to put in through the Open Government Partnership. We'll try to use that initiative to house some of our commitments, which will then interface with the central one at the Secretary General level. So I think the concept of negotiating a large, heavy institution would be up to the particular cluster. Something like a UNEP chemicals cluster might have already structures in place. Others might need new structures. So that would be my long answer for your question.
Yeah, and just to add briefly, I think there are a number of efforts going on in this way. The environmentally sustainable transport forums have been held in Asia, now 6 of them. First one in Latin America last year, one in Europe a couple of years ago. 83 countries have now signed voluntary declarations to support sustainable transportation and international collaboration on that. We're now trying to strengthen the institutional capacity to support the ongoing follow-up to those voluntary commitments with better capacity building at both the national and subnational level, as well as within the UN system. So that's the kind of stuff that could happen.
Okay, I see 2 hands, the brown-haired woman in the aisle, and then another person closer to the front on the right side, and then the woman who worked with PCSD in the back. So please try to ask your questions very quickly. I think we just have a few minutes left.
Hi. Hey, Don. Amy Frankel with the UN Environment Program here in North America. More of just a point of information, which is 2 things. One, actually in the negotiated text, there is some text on sustainable cities, and in fact, it's not bad. And so that is, in addition to the commitments that we might see at Rio, there is some language, and in fact, some of the language I think that the U.S. added in the recent New York negotiations or in that process actually, I think, strengthened it. So there is some interesting language there, and I think that's an important place for people to look at, because that's where governments will say, we think more attention needs to be paid at the city level, and X, Y, or Z needs to be happening there. I also want to just let people know there's a lot of different initiatives on cities, and that's the very good news. In addition, I'm not going to sort of stump for the UNEP one, but we have an initiative on resource-efficient cities that I'd be happy to talk to people about. But the World Bank is involved. We're at the table with them. Habitat. There's a couple of countries that have been leading what's sort of informally known as a Friends of Cities, Sweden and Singapore. And so they're pushing on both fronts, both in the formal text and also for these kinds of initiatives to come forward.
Thank you. The woman in the orange.
My name is Robin Gray. Once upon a time, I served as an intern at Worldwatch for one summer, and I now work for a Quaker organization. I'm here mostly as an interested citizen and someone who has always loved cities and is very interested in urban sustainability. And I come to things like this sort of looking for inspiration and hope and joy and all of these positive movements. And the thing that I'm finding odd is that a lot of it has to deal with large-scale systems and big organizations jetting around the world and having huge conferences and disseminating information to people. And I'm finding that my own interests have taken me sort of in the other direction to the relocalization movement and things like transition towns. And I looked in the index, and there's a little reference to transition towns there, which I haven't read yet. But the question I have is, it's almost ironic, but I'm wondering if anyone's looking at, is there sort of a way to have sort of like Amish urbanism, like a simple living, simple localized living, but in larger population agglomerations. And some of that's in the local food movement, some of it's in the information and technology and the local apps and things, and the crowdsourcing and all that. And what kinds of things are you hearing about relocalization and very do-it-yourself, grassrootsy kinds of movements?
I would I'd say just sort of on an anecdotal level, I think that that's a really strong trend, and actually something that we are thinking of commissioning a story on is the sort of way in which almost the style of the uber urbanite has fallen to the wayside to kind of even stylistically, people dressing and sort of looking like they don't live in a city so much as in a more rural area. So I think that definitely the food movement is a part of the trend towards people really trying to support a local farmer, and I know that there's sort of a lot of people who, there's something even called Philly cow share, where people share a cow and, divide up the cow into various different, you get a quarter of a cow or something like that. And so I think that there's, it's definitely happening on the food level, but, you even see it where, something like a zip car, which isn't, what you would necessarily think of as being simple city living, but it really is, a kind of local community effort to some degree, in the sense that we're all sharing one car rather than, everyone having their own private vehicle. Definitely I think you'll see it even in things like a cclickfix.com, which is a website where you can, develop your own neighborhood group, and everyone is sort of a neighborhood watcher, where people will post, there's graffiti on my post box, my mailbox, and really try to reestablish through technology, which seems kind of weird, a new connection with your, 311 system in your city. So maybe the sort of concluding thought here is that we may not get back to the sort of easy living in a city that's seems totally effortless, but we might end up sort of finding these new technologies or new ways of kind of reconnecting on this very local, block by block level in unexpected ways. So.
And I think to pick up the degrowthing theme that we heard about earlier, I think that has the potential to be spun in a politically very negative way by people on the right. But I think the politically positive way, and I think I sort of don't like the word itself, but I like the prosperity idea, and I think the idea of how do we live in cities and be less consumptive by using bicycles and buses, instead of having to drive cars, and, sharing a car when we do need a car. And there are analogs of that across a whole set of different other aspects of consumerism in cities that can give us a prosperous economy with a smaller footprint.
All right, I just want to check with our organizers. Do we have time for one more question? Or one more? Okay, the woman in the back, please.
The international. I wanted to make a plug for the International Consumer Guidelines, as Jeffrey well knows. We did a lot of work, and Amy knows as well, from UNEP-TIE. And in terms of Principle 10 and transparency and issues. But I want to ask you particularly about something on transportation that may seem, based on what was just said, is counterintuitive. Colleague, friend, woman, physician in Greenwich, Connecticut, and I were having a discussion. And I gave up my car. I live in Iowa, but I gave up my car about my personal car 4 or 5 years ago. So I was suggesting to her, since she drives a Land Rover every day, that she might want to reconsider, because I'm the greenie, right? Okay. And I said, well, actually what you're saying is you just want to drive this car. She said, well, I'm a physician, and I have to be able to have a car I can depend on to get through the snow. If I have to go in for emergency service. I said, fair enough. And I said, by the way, how many times a year does it snow that this situation occurs? We decided maybe tops 5 where there'd be a circumstance, and that's generous, where there'd be a circumstance that she'd have to do this before the streets cleared. And I said, well, how much money do you have? I won't repeat, but well over $1 million between the family annually. I said, so why not have a wardrobe of cars? And I'm saying this very seriously. If you can financially afford it. We don't wear a heavy winter coat every day 365 days a year because a few days of the year it's going to be cold. So I suggested to her she could have her Land Rover if she wanted to for that time period that it's going to be that level of cold. But instead of driving it every day, she could also have, pick one, a smart car, a Prius, or whatever, for most of her daily travel. In other words, we sort of make the options that for a population that is so still wedded to the individual options, is it counterintuitive, but maybe it also is a viable option to put out, having something like a wardrobe of cars. Admittedly, this would not work for everybody, but it might work for some people, and in terms of the overall use, would still help to decarbonize on a use basis the process. What do you think of that?
I think it works well if it's a shared wardrobe. And that's exactly what car sharing, I think, is moving towards. And right now it's a very tiny piece of the market, but I think if I apply my imagination to what sustainable mobility systems might look like in 30 years, we will move away from individual motor vehicle ownership and towards basically purchasing or accessing a package of mobility services. There'll be mobility service providers that offer you a suite of mobility services that come bundled with a public transport pass, that also basically give us discounts if we consume less or at times of less demand, and that charge us a premium if we use the expensive stuff or if we consume peak travel during peak hours through very congested areas. And you'll get a discount on the road system if you drive with the other seats in your car filled with people. And there'll be real-time systems set up that'll have trusted networks so you can fill the seats of your car with workmates or people who live in your neighborhood or other people who are in your trusted Facebook network who share those seats, and you'll get discounts on your mobility for filling those seats. In fact, even earn money, and that will help to smooth out the demand so that actually, because the roads will be priced and managed for peak efficiency, we'll have the reliability on our surface transportation system that we now have in our electricity system, where we won't have brownouts and blackouts every morning and every night during the rush hours like we do today. We'll have a reliable system for which you'll pay more, just like you pay more for telecommunications today than you did 40 or 50 years ago when all you had was the black phone rotary connected with a wire to the wall. But now we pay a lot more, we get a lot more service, and we're all carrying several communication devices. And it serves us better and has a smaller footprint. So I think we're going through a similar revolution in transportation. And this is where I think degrowthing is in some ways a concept that sort of maybe can take us off the wrong way unless we think about how do we build technology into reducing our footprint while increasing our prosperity. I think that's a better way to sell it.
The one thing that I just think is interesting about what you're saying is think of it not just as a wardrobe of cars, but a wardrobe of mobility solutions, period. I have a friend who works for Safe Streets to Schools, and I was saying to her, how do you get those people in Lansing, Michigan to bike to school? And she says, it doesn't have to be you bike to school every single day. It could be once a month. It could be, one meal out of a week where you don't have meat. You don't have to be a vegetarian all the time. So I think thinking about it a little bit less as sort of black and white is a good, way to nudge your friend. You don't have to drive the Land Rover every single day. And, maybe it's a bike next time.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking our speakers, and I also want to thank the Worldwatch Institute. Thank you very much.